What if One Piece had a different main character? What would happen if someone other than Luffy confronted the enemies in the story? Today we will explore this scenery with Zoro as the main character of the story. This video is structured like a video game. Imagine it as a new game plus version. You have completed the game with Luffy and now you can choose another character. Zoro is now the main character. He is tasked with confronting Luffy's enemies with the added abilities of the Gum Gum fruit to make things more exciting. Oda even drew an artwork for this. At the end of the run there will also be a small secret boss fight. Zoro's journey begins similar to the manga and anime. He sets out to become the world's greatest swordsman. He then becomes a bounty hunter to survive. At some point before the start of the story, he is recruited by the Baroque Works. He declines the offer because he is not immediately chosen as the boss of the organization. Zoro eventually arrives in Shellstown, where he kills Helmeppo's wolf Zoro. He is then captured and later rescued by Luffy. This is where Zoro has his first fight in the story. Zoro has no problem defeating Captain Morgan, just like in the original timeline. This fight already exists in the original timeline, and Morgan is simply cut down by Zoro. It's an easy win for our favorite swordsman. The battle against Buggy in Orange Town is quite different. Zoro had trouble with Buggy in the original timeline because this legendary pirate is immune to sword attacks due to his devil fruit. Zoro receives a wound from Buggy but is still able to transport Luffy in a cage. If Zoro were to take Buggy seriously and if Oda wanted Zoro to fight Buggy, I believe he would have won. Zoro may not be able to cut Buggy, but he can still inflict physical damage to him. Zoro is one of the physically strongest characters in the East Blue, and with the help of the Gomu Gomu no Mi, he could deliver some punches to Buggy with a sword in his hand. Similar to what Luffy did in Wano, punching others and holding the 𝙲𝚘𝚙𝚎 in his hand. Zoro's next opponent is Kuro in Syrup Village. In this timeline, Kuro should not be a problem for Zoro. Although Zoro is more susceptible to sword attacks due to the Gomu Gomu no Mi, this is a classical sword fight, so it shouldn't be a problem for him. Now we come to the Baratie arc. In the original timeline, Zoro fights against Mihawk at Baratie, but since Zoro is now confronting Luffy's enemies, this fight shouldn't happen. However, this fight is essential for Zoro's character development. He needs to realize the power difference between him and Mihawk. Additionally, in this fight, two of his swords break and he gets new swords in 𝚤𝚘𝚏. From a narrative perspective, we can give Zoro the fight against Mihawk after he defeats Don Krieg. Zoro can fight Don Krieg with full force. Since Zoro cannot yet cut iron at this point, he may learn to do so during this fight. After all, there was no significant training arc for Zoro between the East Blue and Alabasta Saga. He learned the ability originally in the fight with Des Bones, aka Mr. One. If Zoro can learn to cut iron during this fight, he can beat Don Krieg. After the fight against Don Krieg, Zoro suffers a defeat against Mihawk. He then swears to never lose again. To make Zoro stronger in Along Park, we can wait a while before reaching this plot point, or we can give Zoro a full restore and an elixir to fight Arlong at full strength. The fight against Arlong should not be a problem for Zoro with full HP and the Gomu Gomu no Mi. Zoro should not be as stupid to bury himself in the ground and then be thrown into the pool by Arlong. In the original timeline, Arlong was already afraid of Zoro when he saw him fight with an open chest. A fully recovered Zoro should be able to cut Arlong. I have a feeling that Oda nerfed Zoro in the original timeline in the East Blue. Zoro always gets injured, so that he cannot fight in the next arc or can only fight with a handicap. In 𝚤𝚘𝚏, then Zoro obtains the Zandai Kitetsu and the Yubashiri. With these new swords, Zoro confronts Smoker. Just like in the original timeline, Zoro has no chance against Smoker here. No attack without Haki can harm him. This fight cannot be won. Therefore, the Straw Hat crew must flee. Most of the opponents in the East Blue Saga are not a problem for Zoro. Only Buggy and maybe Don Krieg could be a problem if Zoro doesn't learn new abilities and adapts his fighting techniques. If you liked this video so far, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. This really helps me tremendously. The adventure of Zoro continues then on the Grand Line. In total, Zoro has to face 11 antagonists here. On Little Garden, he faces Galdino. This fight could be a bit more difficult for Zoro. In the original timeline, Zoro was captured by Galdino to be turned into a wax figure. Galdino's wax becomes as hard as steel when it solidifies, making it immune to Zoro's sword attacks. However, the wax is vulnerable to fire and its own wax. This fight could be very difficult for Zoro. He could use his rubber abilities to give his sword attacks a certain range and inflict wounds on Galdino before he is even able to produce his wax. However, the fight could also end in defeat if Zoro fails to avoid Galdino's wax in time. He would have to learn to cut the wax in this fight. The experience he gained in the fight against Don Krieg could help him with this. If Zoro manages to cut the wax, he could win here. If not, he would lose the fight. The fight against Wapol on Drum Island would be much simpler. Similar to Luffy could defeat the Tin Man with a few attacks, so that shouldn't really be a problem. Against Sir Crocodile and Alabasta, things look a bit different. At the beginning, Zoro would not be able to inflict any wounds on Sir Crocodile. Zoro would have to learn Crocodile's weakness. However, it is questionable from whom he should receive this information. He would have to notice it himself during the fight, maybe even by bleeding and seeing how the blood sticks to Crocodile. For example, in his first defeat, Luffy received the information that he can grab Crocodile when he is wet. If Zoro is able to find out Crocodile's weakness, he should be able to defeat him like Luffy. He should be very careful of Crocodile's sense attacks so as not to be hit by them. In the end, Zoro should be able to defeat Crocodile here. Then on Jaya, Zoro faces Bellamy. Similar to Luffy, he defeats Bellamy with just one attack. With the help of the knock-up stream, the Straw Hat crew travels to Skypiea. There, Zoro has to face the self-proclaimed god Eneru. This fight already happened in the original timeline, and Zoro lost because he couldn't withstand Eneru's thunder attacks. However, in this timeline, with the help of the Gomu Gomu no Mi, that should not be a problem. Eneru could, similar to the original timeline, transform his staff into a trident. This could certainly damage Rubber Zoro. In addition, his mantra could help him avoid Zoro's attack. However, Zoro could try to surprise Eneru with his attacks, similar to Luffy. In the end, Eneru would have no chance against an opponent who possesses the Gomu Gomu no Mi. Back on the Blue Sea, Zoro has to fight Kuzan. This fight will end in defeat similar to the other timelines. Without Haki and with the current physical strength that Zoro has at this point in the story, he would not be able to defeat Kuzan. On Ines Lobby, Zoro has to face Rob Lucci. This fight could be very tricky. In the original timeline, Zoro won against Kaku, who had a Doriki value of around 2200. Kaku had just acquired the Bull Fruit model giraffe on the day of the fight with Zoro. Lucci, on the other hand, has been in possession of his Zoan Devil Fruit for several years. His Doriki value without the abilities of his Zoan Fruit is around 4000. This means that Rob Lucci's physical abilities are almost twice as strong as Kaku's. Zoro will not have an easy fight here. The only way I can imagine Zoro winning is if he learns to use Gear 2nd and Gear 3rd. This would give Zoro increased speed. With Gear 2nd, Rubber Zoro could certainly keep up with Lucci's speed in his Zoan form. In addition, Zoro could withstand some of Lucci's attacks due to the physical resistance of the Gomu Gomu no Mi. With Gear 2nd, Zoro could use Jet Onigiri in an all-out fight. Zoro would certainly be able to somehow defeat Rob Lucci, but only if he manages to learn the gear forms and combine them with his attacks. In the end, Zoro wins with a Jet Ashura attack. By the way, his Yubashiri is destroyed by Shu on Ines Lobby, so Zoro needs a new sword. On Thriller Bark, Zoro then faces Gekko Moria. This shouldn't be a problem either. The real problem on Thriller Bark was Oz with Luffy's shadow, but the fight against Gekko Moria should not be a problem with the gear forms and Zoro's sword skills. Gekko Moria also has swords to fight with, however his swords shouldn't be really a problem for Zoro. Zoro also has to fight Ryuma to get his Shuzui. This fight ends in a similar way, just like in the original timeline. Although Zoro does not actually travel to Impel Down, in this new game Plus mode, Zoro has to face Luffy's antagonist. In Impel Down, he has to fight Magellan. Just like Luffy, Zoro can do nothing against the poison Paramecia user. Magellan would simply poison Zoro and Zoro would lose against him. If Zoro also faces Blackbeard in Impel Down in this run, then the whole thing could be very interesting. Although Blackbeard can nullify Zoro's Devil Fruit with his Yami Yami no Mi, Zoro is primarily a swordsman who can also use ranged attacks and has powerful endurance and resilience. He could certainly cause some damage to Blackbeard, however I also believe that this fight, like in the original timeline, will be interrupted and will have no real conclusion. On Marineford, Zoro then faces Sengoku. Similar to the original timeline, Zoro cannot harm Sengoku here. Even with the increased resistance to physical attacks, Zoro unfortunately has no chance against Sengoku. In this timeline, Ace cannot be saved either. On the Grand Line, Zoro would have significant difficulties with many of the opponents. The fights would not be as simple as in the runs with Luffy, especially Galdino and Rob Lucci are very difficult opponents for Zoro. We then come to the time skip. During this time, Zoro trains with Mihawk and learns Observation and Armament Haki. He learns his Conqueror's Haki later in the run on Wano. Additionally, Zoro has taught himself Gear 4 Boundman and Gear 4 Snakeman. The Straw Hats then travel to Fishman Island and Zoro confronts Hody Jones. This fight also takes place in the original timeline. Unfortunately, the fight is interrupted. However, in this run Zoro will face Oden and honestly defeat him with ease, just like Luffy did in the original timeline. The situation with Caesar will run quite similarly. I even believe that Zoro has a better chance against Caesar with his long-range attacks. After all, Caesar uses various poisonous gases that work best at a very close distance. For example, he was able to deprive Luffy of oxygen in the original timeline. But in this timeline it shouldn't be a problem. With some jet sword attacks, Caesar should be knocked out. On Dressrosa, the fight against Doflamingo takes place. This battle will probably not be as easy, just like in the original timeline. Although Zoro now mastered Armament and Observation Haki and the Gear 4 forms, Doflamingo and his abilities shouldn't be underestimated. After all, Doflamingo mastered the awakening of his Devil Fruit, and he also has over 30 years of expertise with his Devil Fruit. Zoro could certainly get help from Law, as he did in the original timeline. Law destroyed Doflamingo's internal organs with a gamma knife, which Doflamingo then had to heal with his strings. This was a big help for Luffy in the original timeline and a big handicap for Doflamingo. In the end, Rubber Zoro will surely be able to win the fight, probably with the help of Gear 4 Bounceman. But it will not be an easy fight. On Whole Cake Island, then Zoro wants to help his best friend Sanji. The fights on Whole Cake Island will be slightly different from the original timeline, because Zoro isn't as gluttonous as Luffy, so he won't benefit from the skill in the fight against Cracker and Katakuri. The fight against Cracker could be won with the help of Nami, just like in the original timeline. However, without her help, it would surely be a difficult fight for Zoro. Although Zoro can destroy Cracker's biscuit soldiers with his sword attacks, Cracker can produce and control them indefinitely, making this fight more about endurance. Luffy won the fight because he ate all the biscuits, grew bigger, and then threw Cracker away in his Tankman form. This scenery won't necessarily happen in this fight. Zoro will surely tire Cracker out with his endurance and thus defeat him. In my opinion, this fight will be much more difficult for Zoro than it was for Luffy in the original timeline. The fight against Katakuri will be interesting. The fight will be quite similar, but unlike Luffy, Zoro will attack with more long-range attacks to recognize the weakness of Katakuri's Devil Fruit. Additionally, Katakuri will be more reliant on his trident Mogura. While Katakuri can dodge some sword attacks with his advanced observation haki, his concentration will eventually decrease. As we saw in the fight between Zoro and King, Zoro observes his opponents very precisely during a battle. He realized that King is vulnerable when his flame on his back is out. It will probably be similar against Katakuri. Eventually, Zoro will realize that Katakuri isn't a Logia user, but instead deforms his body with the help of his observation haki. He could then try to cut Katakuri into pieces with an incredible amount of quick sword attacks. He could use Gear 4 Snakeman combined with Jet Culverine on Giri to cut Katakuri quickly. With Snakeman's speed, he won't give Katakuri any time to recover. I also believe that Zoro can win in an all-out fight against Katakuri. Luffy's weakness was that Katakuri's physical attacks were stronger than his own Gomu Gomu no attacks. But Zoro primarily fights with swords, so that shouldn't be a problem here. On Wano Kuni, Zoro will face off against Kaido, similar to the original timeline. I don't see how Zoro can win against Kaido without awakening his fruit. On Wano, Zoro will earn Conqueror's Haki and also Advanced Conqueror's Haki. In the original timeline, Zoro was even able to give Kaido a scar without possession of the Advanced Conqueror's Haki. Just like Kaido said, his Ashura attack seems to contain elements of Conqueror's Haki. Zoro will also trigger the awakening of his fruit in this fight. However, unlike Luffy, Zoro will not be able to do much with these new absurd abilities. I can imagine that Zoro will turn his surroundings into rubber to throw his opponents off balance. I could also imagine Zoro turning his swords into rubber to even change their shape. Could Zoro even expand or enlarge his sword similar to Aum in Skypiea? Luffy was also able to turn into a giant through his awakening. Is Zoro also capable of this? Could Zoro even become a giant and grow his swords along with him? After all, the clothes grow in this form, so why not the weapons? If Gear 5 Zoro can really become a giant rubber swordsman with Conqueror's Haki, then I really don't see how Kaido can stop this form. Even his Flame Dragon should not be a problem for this, because Gear 5 Zoro would not finish Kaido with a pure physical attack, but probably with a Bairang Ashura attack. Imagine an Ashura attack as big as Onigashima. That would be crazy. If the giant form really works here, then Gear 5 Zoro could defeat Kaido and save Wano Kuni. Finally, Zoro can face off against the secret boss in this run. It's actually Mihawk. After his victory against Kaido, Zoro was confident that he can finally take on Mihawk. I even believe that Zoro could compete with Mihawk in this fight, however I honestly don't think Zoro would win here. Physically they could be evenly matched, but when it comes to their skills as swordsmen, I don't think Zoro has reached Mihawk's level yet. After all, Zoro is still not able to create black blades while Mihawk is. So far we only know Ryuma and Mihawk who are capable of this. That means there's still a certain skill gap between these two characters, and therefore I don't think Zoro could defeat the secret boss in this run. But how good is Zoro really as a main character? He actually is a very good main character in this run. He has his difficulties here and there, but with the right skills, Zoro could definitely have a chance against Luffy's antagonists, at least on a similar level to Luffy. After all, even Luffy didn't win every fight in the original timeline. For example, I didn't think Don Krieg and Galdino could be such difficult fights for Zoro. Rob Lucci, Cracker and Kaido could also prove to be very tricky, but these were all fights that even Luffy struggled with in the original timeline. Especially with Cracker and Kaido, Luffy actively needed the help of others. Which new main character should play next through the story of One Piece? Let me know in the comments. And if you liked this video, why not watch this video next, where Luffy ate the dragon fruit?